but I was one of the first generation of academics to get into studying innovation several decades ago. I've got a bit of an interdisciplinary background from natural and social sciences. I spent many years teaching innovation to MBA students in business schools, but I became less satisfied with simply looking at it from the perspective of one firm beating the opposition, and became increasingly interested in how innovation can address contemporary social challenges, whether it's to do with the environment or to do with health. So I'm going to share some of my thoughts on this with you today. So my broad topic is transformative innovation policy. By this, I mean a new domain of policy in many governments across the world, which I think we can explain by the political appeal of innovation as a solution to societal problems. The simplest and broadest definition of innovation is novelty translated into practice. It's not just a new idea, but it's when an idea actually changes either a product that we consume or the way we run our organizations or systems more generally. Clearly, from a politician's perspective, the prospect of being able to transform things without unleashing the rather disruptive processes of wider societal change and revolutionary upheaval has a lot of appeal. And so as governments have become confronted with some big persistent societal challenges, such as climate change, such as global health, such as social inclusion, innovation becomes appealing as a route to try and change things in order to address some of those problems. I've done a lot of work on climate change, and I'll refer to that a bit, but I've also increasingly looked at health issues, and I'll also use some examples there. The broad context, I think, is a shift in what are seen as the broad aims and goals of governments in recent years. I think it's fair to say that in the 20th century, particularly the last half of the 20th century, following the more secure context after the Second World War, national competitiveness was the overriding goal perceived by most national governments. By the 21st century, we've actually seen that these have been in many ways supplanted by what can conveniently be summarized as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which of course present governments with a much bigger range of goals, from big environmental and ecological challenges at a global level, through to basic economic and social welfare issues, which are still a challenge for many countries throughout the world, and weaving these together into a more plausible, sustainable development trajectory, which commands broad popular consent. So we've seen a shift in the terrain of what are perceived as the headline national goals for innovation policy. And what I'm going to talk about today is how this attempt to develop that type of transformative innovation policy immediately has to confront the fact that we have contrasting models of what innovation is and what is the process whereby innovation is successfully achieved and happens. I'm presenting a simplified framework which is grounded in the more complicated academic literature in the area, and I contrast two broad different approaches to understanding innovation. The one I label the pipeline model. This essentially views innovation as a science-driven process. Ideas emerge in the lab. They get pushed through a variety of stages to try and interpret their feasibility, to work out their practicality, to implement those ideas in practice. So it's very often portrayed as a stage model, a pipeline going from scientific discovery, passing through invention, engineering and manufacturing activities, and ending with the marketing of a new product or process. In contrast with that, we can identify a model of innovation which is much more of a network model of innovation. Instead of seeing new science as the trigger for innovation, instead it sees it as shaped by social actors, a variety of social actors who have to interact with each other in order to make innovation happen. So the network model of innovation sees it as a complex and pluralistic pattern of interactions, exchanges and relationships between actors participating in that process. So if you follow any policy discussion on innovation or any economics or business oriented discussion on innovation, you'll tend to find references to these implicit models, these different models of how innovation may be understood. If we delve down into the academic literature more deeply over the years, which of course is the academic's favorite pursuit, we can actually trace the roots of the pipeline and the network model in a contrasting economic approach to innovation and a sociological approach to innovation. The most prominent economist of innovation is Joseph Schumpeter. He really pioneered the notion that innovation could be seen as the engine of economic growth. His focus is on innovation within the business organization. The focus is on economic development. He draws a strict line separating innovation from processes of invention, creativity, or imitation, simply diffusing an existing innovation into the wider society and economy. He's been very much a pioneer of evolutionary economics, and so the evolutionary economic model of innovation is that you have firms creating variety of different possible innovations and a process of selection favoring some of these and killing off the others. And the term creative destruction, of course, is a widely known term to symbolize that process of creating novelty and new firms rising and displacing old firms in that process. It's very technologically oriented, so I tend to call this a techno-scientific approach to innovation. We can contrast Schumpeter's economic take with Gabriel Tard's sociological take. Tard probably was the earliest pioneer of attempts to try and understand innovation back in the 19th century. He drew a much broader definition of innovation involving novelty in all spheres of social life, not just the economic, not just the technological, but also the social, the cultural, the artistic as well. Tard didn't distinguish between the creative aspects of invention or the more mundane processes of diffusing new innovations. He bundled them all together as an intersection of innovation and these different activities. He saw conflict and contradiction, dialectical processes as central to the process of innovation, and clearly network building was part of the way to achieve successful innovation. This can best be described as a socio-technical approach to innovation in contrast to the techno-scientific approach of Schumpeter. If we take those two broad frameworks, the goals and aims of innovation and the process models of innovation itself, we can broadly see a range of different paradigms of innovation policy, which can be seen in the past decades. If we start in the bottom left-hand corner of this matrix, we see a narrow pipeline model of innovation applied to narrow goals of national competitiveness. This was very much the big science innovation paradigm of the 1950s to the 1970s. This broadens its model of innovation into the 1980s and 90s to a wider network model, but it remains preoccupied with the narrow social goals of national competitiveness. If we then move to the more recent past, we see a shift towards these global challenges that I've talked about. But again, we see some of the approaches, which I call a mission-oriented approach, still tending to be more pipeline techno-scientific in focus, while what I call the systems transitions approach adopts a wider interactive socio-technical network perspective. So the period of the 1950s to the 1970s was marked very much by the big state-led science-driven projects. It started with Atoms for Peace, the development of civil nuclear power. It included projects like Concorde to try and apply supersonic transport to civil air travel. But of course, its outstanding exemplar was the Apollo moonshot program. So all of these programs, they pursued some sort of national competitiveness. There was an argument about the degree to which economic competitiveness or security competitiveness dominated, and this actually became quite an important issue subsequently. So it's not difficult to understand the background to that period of the 50s to the 70s. It was the aftermath of the Second World War, where science had been seen to play a key role in the final outcome of that war, whether it was atomic weapons as used in Japan at the end of the war, or even discoveries of medicine such as penicillin, which contributed to the overall war effort. At the time, there was growing concern as to whether the narrow focus on security and economic performance was justified. And certainly there was a lot of soul searching after the success of the Apollo missions and the moon landing. And they developed a strong lobby, particularly in the United States, to apply that big science model to big social problems such as health. And cancer, of course, was the area that received a lot of promotion as the prime candidate to apply this model of innovation policy to. So Sidney Farber argued that we only lack the will and the money and the comprehensive planning that went into putting a man on the moon to try and find a cure for cancer. And so in response to this, President Nixon did launch what subsequently became known as the War on Cancer, which was a decade-long program of investments in an attempt to apply a moonshot model to the problem of cancer. I think it's fair to say this is not an argument about whether or not the investment in cancer research in the 70s delivered anything of any value or not. The issue is whether it delivered the promised goal, which was a breakthrough equivalent to the Apollo moonshot. And I think by consensus, the agreement would be that it was not possible to replicate that type of mission in the field of cancer. And in a sense, it was the disappointment in the inability to extend the big science model to some other societal challenges, as well as serious questions about the economic benefit of those science-based big projects. As you know, for many years, there were arguments about whether civil nuclear power or supersonic civil air aviation actually were successful in economic terms. I think the general agreement was they were not very successful. So by the 1980s, you actually had an about turn in the focus of government policy for innovation, and really a rejection of that big project moonshot mission approach. So instead, an approach was promoted, which we can generally regard as a market-led innovation policy approach. What was the significance of this? Well, it was quite deliberately to get the government and the state out of trying to do innovation. The term picking winners was the criticism that was leveled at the old style big projects. And it was argued that the only organizations who were fit for pursuing innovation were business organizations and the firm. Government had a role in setting the framework conditions in which those firms operated. Such framework conditions might include investment in basic scientific research rather than commercial scientific research, encouraging an interface between the academic world of science and the business world of innovation, promoting a regulatory environment which gave more freedom to businesses to pursue the innovation pathways that they wanted. So from the early 80s onwards, we see this abrupt shift in the focus of government innovation policy to a more market-led approach. And this was the heyday of the rise of innovation, management of innovation programs on MBA courses, books on innovation and the theory of the firm and managing innovation. So in other words, not government policy as the focus, but business strategy as the new focus for innovation policy. And I couldn't resist putting a picture of Boris Johnson leaving Downing Street at lunchtime today. But he's a great rhetorician, Boris Johnson, and has argued quite strongly that innovation is the job of business, not of the state, and memorably put it that only capitalism can cure cancer, and used this as a stick to beat the Labour Party's support for investment in public research. Strangely enough, although this big change, sea change, occurred from a big science, mission-oriented moonshot approach to this market-led, business-based model of innovation, at about the time that this more market-oriented approach was taking off, rumblings began to emerge about a new global challenge of climate change. And oddly enough, it was really by the 2000s, so after the market-led model had been up and running for 20 to 30 years, that Nicholas Stern, for example, a leading global economist, argued that if you wanted to address climate change, you needed to acknowledge that this was a market failure. In fact, he called it the widest ranging market failure ever seen. And so his argument was that this required a new era of public policy to try and address this newly emerging global challenge. And the way he formulated it was managing the transition to a low carbon economy. So this was a big change really in policy focus, because it suggested that you couldn't really just rely on mainstream business innovation activities as normal, even though some companies were quite active in pursuing more environmentally sustainable innovations. What they were doing was simply not enough to deal with the global challenge of climate change. And that arguments that we simply needed to move to a no growth economy and radically change our lifestyle and attitude to prosperity were seen as politically unrealistic. And so this is what led to a new focus on an innovation policy oriented towards a transition to a low carbon economy. And interestingly enough, it very soon led to a revival of the moonshot notion of mission-oriented innovation. A variety of leading scientists from across the world launched a global Apollo program to combat climate change. A network called Mission Innovation was established, and this was a quite deliberate proposal to replicate the huge R&D investment of over $25 billion at the time, which is estimated to be about $250 billion 2020 dollars, to, as Martin Rees, president of the Royal Society, put it, an ambitious public investment in more R&D for new, far from the market energy technologies. So this was a program of techno-scientific mission investment through a big program of research and development. At the same time, others argued for something a bit different to a moonshot type mission. Their model was much more the Roosevelt type New Deal of the 1930s, where the proposal was for a much wider social transition, which would involve a whole diversity of types of innovation, would involve multiple systems, not just how you made electricity within the power sector, but how you used it in your transport system, how you created greenhouse gases in your food and agriculture system, how you used energy within buildings and your domestic residences. And so it suggested you needed to address end-use demand as well as supply-side innovations. And this was articulated even more clearly in the European Green Deal several years later, which basically says we need to transform a variety of systems in transport, buildings, food, energy and industry in order to address global environmental issues, including climate change. It's fairly clear that these policy responses to the global challenge of climate change, which used the terms missions and transitions, were themselves reflecting this contrast between these fundamentally different models of how innovation occurred, its dynamics and how it should be managed and steered. Missions were drawing on this economic science-driven pipeline model, while transitions were drawing on a sociological, made by actors, network model. So I've written pipeline there, that was a mistake, network model. So they were different models of innovation, though they both shared what we could call a transformative turn. They were both saying that innovation policy needed to address these new global challenges. If we look at the way in which they are articulated by their advocates, we can see that they share some similarities with the past, but they're also different. Certainly, mission-oriented innovation policy does seek to be more systemic in nature rather than driven simply by scientific discovery. Yet it still tends to follow a pipeline stage-based process from strategic orientation through policy coordination to policy implementation. So the OECD has been promoting this model of a new mission-oriented innovation policy approach. While transitions policy adopts a much broader network systemic approach, this diagram is very commonly used to express the transitions framework. It can best be seen as three levels: a top level of broad landscape conditions, a bottom level of niches in which new innovations are developed by new entrants and entrepreneurial firms, and a meso level, a middle layer of the regimes in which our society and economy is currently embedded. In other words, that we're embedded in a high carbon regime in terms of the transport systems we have, the buildings we live in, the energy systems that we have. In order to innovate, to challenge that unsustainable regime, you need a mixture of bottom-up novelty created by entrepreneurial actors, combined with broader top-down policy landscape pressure to discourage the old regime and to make life more attractive for the new low carbon, net zero sustainable alternatives. So it's a policy mix of encouraging bottom-up entrepreneurship and innovation and applying wider policy and regulatory and economic pressures to discourage the old unsustainable regimes and to facilitate and encourage new innovations to reconfigure that regime. We see in climate change policy a persistent tension between the missions and the transitions approach as to which offers the best route to challenge the incumbent greenhouse gas regime. The mission approach tends to emphasize low carbon energy supply driven innovation through renewables, hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. The transitions approach tends to favor end use and system reconfiguration around housing, mobility and food. So it remains a pretty important policy debate. As far as European innovation policy is concerned, the mission-oriented policy has become very popular and was adopted as the new broad framework for research and innovation in the EU. And of particular interest to our group here tonight, cancer was identified as one of the first missions to receive the attention in this new mission-oriented approach through the proposed mission of Conquering Cancer Mission Possible. Although it aims at a broader systemic perspective, the moonshot still persists as the metaphor for transformation. And so It echoes in some ways the cancer moonshot launched in the United States under the Obama administration, put on the back burner during Trump, and now revived under Biden. But although the moonshot metaphor persists, I think it's unfair to simply regard the new cancer mission as simply reheating the old 1960s moonshot type of program. First of all, it is clearly much broader in the mission that it articulates. And so the Conquering Cancer mission, and now also the US moonshot program, clearly state that they seek to innovate in what they call the broad cancer continuum, ranging from prevention through detection and diagnosis, right through to treatment and to care. So ostensibly, the aspiration is to pursue a much broader mission to address a whole range of targets as far as cancer care is concerned. Now, the question I think this raises is whether the way that it is being articulated actually captures what I would call the broader transition perspective in order to enable such a broad set of missions to be achieved. The broader transitions perspective argues that you need to promote a much wider range of diversity in order to challenge lock-in to the present system. And so in order to do that, you actually need to create new innovation ecosystems, which will be different in their nature if they are going to facilitate innovation around prevention and detection, for example. That you will need a much greater variety of niche actors and knowledge practices, which go far beyond the specialisms within oncology and biosciences. And so you need to promote new regimes which offer different models for dealing with cancer. So this is a big challenge. So this is a different model to saying there's an area of science which holds the promise of finding a solution to cancer, and it needs the same scale of endeavor as the moonshot did in order to make this happen. Instead, it requires, to some extent, to make life a bit more uncomfortable for the traditional approaches through landscape pressures. And you need to enable new entrants to thrive, even if they are not powerful organizations or very well endowed financially within the current system. In other words, you need a policy to enable a greater variety and diversity of innovation actors who may offer different approaches in fields such as prevention, detection, and care, for example. There is an incumbent regime within the cancer innovation system, which is still very much basing its promise on the potential for innovation in terms of pharmacological innovations. And in some ways, having gone through the doldrums for several decades, the recent couple of decades, of course, shown an upward trajectory in terms of the drug innovations actually entering the marketplace. So the question is whether the interpretation that this is a harbinger of a moonshot focus which could deliver results is well founded or not. As you all know, that optimism is contested by other clinical knowledge communities around the efficacy or the relative efficacy of newly marketed medicines and some of the techniques and methods used in clinical trials, as well as the inherent scientific complexity of cancer as a condition. Yet the current policy, which very much emerges from that market-led era of innovation policy, is very favorably disposed towards that narrow incumbent regime. The global influence of the US health reimbursement system tends to be blind to price, and so offers a global incentive to continue with expensive Me Too drug introductions. The FDA has deliberately changed its regulatory system to favor regulatory approval for similar medicinal innovations. There is a curative culture within the medical system which is shared by professionals and patients. And post-genomics dominates the bioscience focus on personalized medical promises. So the question is, are there any signs of more transition policy initiatives to try and enable a broader approach to transformative innovation policy? The Cancer Research UK roadmap on early detection and diagnosis, I think, is one of the few examples which suggests a different type and a much more transitions-oriented approach. It recognizes you need a new innovation ecosystem if you want to promote early detection and and you need different incentives and business models to facilitate early detection and diagnosis. So this recognizes that the current knowledge system has limits, and that if you want to encourage a variety of innovation, you need to change that system to some extent. And it does make proposals for that. It suggests social innovation as a new health economic model. It suggests entrepreneurial incubators through organizational innovation and a new type of knowledge infrastructure platform for trials. It's got its weaknesses, but nevertheless, it indicates a different type of approach and a more transitions-informed policy framework. So in conclusion then, if these new policy mission aspirations are to be fulfilled, they need much more of a transition-oriented transformative innovation policy. Without that, then a narrow mission will tend to be shaped by the dominant incumbents. New actors and new types of knowledge need to be actively supported and promoted for system diversity. Some pressure needs to be put to limit the domination of incumbent players. And this network model, what I would call an interactionist and socio-technical approach to innovation, needs to be drawn upon much more fully in order to fulfill this policy goal. So I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. If you can close the presentation, we can start discussion, seeing everyone's faces. So any questions for Fred? It's been deep, a lot of theory. So I do have one question for you to kick off the discussion. You talked a lot about the pathways and the environment that needs to be created, but the question is, how do we define innovation? And the reason I'm asking this question, because I think this is actually quite tricky. And the example I can give is from well, the only field I borderline know is, let's say, UK innovation policy for healthcare. This became a very big political tool, and NICE is very active in this action to try to support innovation in one way or another, but it almost this kind of ephemeral brand name for something, which is hard to define. And especially in medicine, where for the pharmaceutical company, they will tell you a new mode of action is innovation. Then it takes 20 years to see that this particular drug having technically new mode of action actually does not change anything clinically for the patient. On capitalizing on that innovation, collecting all the rewards associated with this innovation, financial applauds, and everything, we actually don't have an innovation. And then something that, let's say, did not receive earlier approval, over time may end up becoming a very important innovation. So where are we with definitions, and where are we with timelines, particularly in healthcare?
Okay. I am firmly of the belief that innovation is a relative, not an absolute concept. And if you try and get too deeply into this is a real innovation, that isn't an innovation, one gets into quite complicated territory. Innovation is, there is a test of practice for innovation to be regarded as innovation. So simply a new idea or something that claims to offer something, I don't think merits the term innovation. It needs to deliver some novelty in practice. Seems to me that is the requirement of being regarded as innovation. But then that covers an enormous spectrum from marginal practical impact to revolutionary impact, from local impact to global impact. But I think it's rather important to keep the spectrum on the agenda for policy. And one of the reasons for this is that I do think there are different advocacy coalitions around the territory of innovation, because it's quite, as well as general social legitimacy, it has commercial currency in marketing terms, and it has policy currency in terms of receiving support from public policy and funds. So it's a contested territory. And in many ways, the territory has tended to be captured by the science-based model of innovation, in my view, to the exclusion, unfortunately, of areas of innovation that deserve more attention. So let me just give you an example from climate change. There's still a fascination amongst many engineers with energy storage through new types of batteries, through trying to find new sources of carbon-free electricity. Whereas, for example, the bicycle is seen as an innovation from the 19th century. Yet the truth is, if you go out of your office onto the street now, you will see a bicycle, which is the same as the 19th century bicycle, but actually it's part of a digital platform where you don't have to own the bicycle to get on it and take a journey, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and using a bicycle. So it's not novel in a scientific sense, in old-fashioned science sense, but it's very novel in terms of its impact. Now, I would say the same happens to some extent around health and cancer, that there clearly is scope for innovations around prevention, which will draw upon a mix of big data and of insight, modern insights of behavioral science. Yet they are still marginalized as far as being seen as central to the innovation policy agenda. So I'm a great fan of a broad relative model of innovation to be more inclusive about a wider range of innovations that deserve attention and support.
Thank you. Any comments, questions for Fred? I do have another question for you. Do you think, I mean, this, like from Jack's talks, when he clearly presents data showing that it's becoming more and more difficult to find new drugs, it's becoming more difficult to innovate, and perhaps this is true across a few areas. However, once again, it depends how we define innovation. I think your bicycle example is a good one. But if we take this kind of packageable examples of amazing breakthrough drugs like penicillin or insulin, and we're getting fewer and fewer these types of innovations. Do you think this is the reason why we need a policy around it, a framework, a catalyst? Because as I understand, firm and the government are simply structures. Well, they're not simply, they're essential structures for much of the innovation to happen now, because the real key for innovation is human creativity. This is our raison d'etre. But the thing is, it's not possible without platforms and the money in some fields. In some fields, it's probably possible to learn your couch and invent something, but in others, you really, really need this formal state or corporate support to try to test your ideas to bring this innovation to life. So do you think the increase or the need for this policy became such because it's becoming harder to innovate, or innovation moves into different domains, or because actually our productivity in innovation these days is so much more than it was in previous generations? Where are we with that?
I don't know is the answer, but what I do know is, I mean, pharma is like many other industrial sectors. Industrial sectors reflect success from the past. I mean, this is the fundamental contradiction facing governments with their policy on innovation. When they look round at the industrial landscape, i.e. the powerful organizations, the ones that are valued in billions of dollars, the ones that employ thousands and thousands of technically qualified staff, the movers and shapers of markets and systems, they're all based on the past. I mean, it's, you know, I mean, Bill Gates still presents himself as an entrepreneur. I mean, he's a corporate business tycoon whose entrepreneurship was when I was a student in the 1960s. So this is, now, there's a problem here, because as you rightly say, you can't say, oh, I don't care about the powerful incumbents. I mean, you can't, that's not a viable policy. You have to have something to say about them. Now, superficial writing them off is wrong. And they will remain part, they're likely to remain part of the future landscape. The real question is, are they going to lead the future? That's the question. And there the answer is not clear, but it's certainly not it's by no means obvious they're going to lead the future. I mean, it's neither one thing or the other. You can't say they're going to disappear next year or the future is going to be shaped by them. They may or may not. And that's where judgment, which of course is what you have to do if you're a business manager, if you're a research director, if you're an investor, you have to make those judgments. Well, so too, if you're a policymaker, you've got to make the judgments about where is the future likely to lie, and should I put all of my eggs in one basket? And my view on the likelihood of a second wave of pharmacological revolution like the 1950s and 1960s, I'd say is unlikely. No one could say it's not possible, but it's not likely. So if my job is to spend public money or pass public laws where the public want me to do it in a way that could facilitate positive developments in the future to deal with illness such as cancer, then I would say I can't justify just sticking with one basket, however powerful it is or technically expert it is. It's a highly risky strategy, and so I do research in both the climate and the health areas. The climate area was like this 30 years ago, where basically everyone said oil companies rule the world and anything else was treated as a joke, and that has changed. I find the health area is lagging to some extent in that there is still an extraordinarily narrow focus and, well, a gamble on a certain promise. Now, by all means, invest in that promise. No one's saying you shouldn't do that, but to invest your total policy effort, and in some ways, some of the mission advocates are saying increase the focus. This is the solution. You've just got to put more resource into it. In my view, it's misguided. It's misguided. Yeah.
Agreed. Sophia, your question or comment? You're muted.
There. Sorry. Thank you, Fred, for this talk. This really caught me unprepared again. I think I got into the swing eventually, but it's about a part of perhaps economics that I'm not very versed in at all. But I was particularly interested to see what you picture in these innovation policy paradigms, the chart between the process and the goals, and how innovation is driven by different things, whether it's big science or led by the market. And I'm not sure I understood very well what you meant by system transitions, but I can see there's a big case for mission-oriented innovation-driven policy. Or I think, like many of us, I am concerned that perhaps innovation nowadays is not really happening by the needs of society much, but just driven by sort of technological advances which respond to market forces and yes, and offer and demand. So, but obviously we've got some sustainable goals which have been defined. We've got the antimicrobial stewardship requirement really at our doors, and many others. And I don't know whether this graph that you show us is something that is dynamic, can be dynamic. Can we alter how innovation may happen, driven by big science or by other forces which are not just directly related to the offer and demand? Yes.
Well, that's the central question. Again, we know there are historical examples where policy has led and enabled innovation, but that doesn't tell. And there are many cases where innovation has occurred without any purpose driven by policy or even by business. I mean, Steward, who was the innovator of the modern telephone exchange, was driven by an obsessive anxiety that the telephone operators were listening to his telephone conversations. And so he was driven to develop an automatic system so the telephone girl couldn't listen into his conversation. So that's not driven by, I mean, that's driven by individual idiosyncrasy. So I think this is my point, that the re-emergence of the mission as society is trying to articulate goals that are important to it and that we want innovation to address is a good thing. And it can deliver, but it doesn't necessarily deliver. And that's why the models that you have for the innovation process are then extremely important. Because if the model is simply the government will spend, what did I say? It was $250 billion on the Apollo moon mission. Now, you take me into a room full of any scientist, bioscientists, energy scientists, I will show you 20 powerful, technically sophisticated advocates as to why government should spend $250 billion on their area of expertise. I mean, that is what the policymaker is confronted by, a battleground of expert advocates saying, I know the solution to cancer, I know the solution to climate change, you must just give me $250 billion, to which the answer is no, because you are simply an advocate and no one knows which is going to be the successful route. Therefore, as a policymaker, I want to pursue the mission, but I need to ensure there's enough variety to make it feasible and realistic, that there may be some success. There may not be, but it's got to be plausible. And that's why variety is so important. Now, clearly, as soon as you have a system which you're all familiar with, big labs dominating the knowledge system, big companies dominating the industrial system, well, if you want more variety, you have to ensure that business-oriented spaces, knowledge-oriented spaces exist to enable this variety. And if you don't think, and you need to make a judgment about it, and I would say the big pharma corporate structure is a bit monolithic. The new bio startups offered more variety, but most of them have entered a strong dependency relationship with the big companies. Jack's more an expert on this than I am. So you need to create what I call a new ecosystem. That means you enable new types of businesses. And how do you do that? You don't just bankroll them, but you might guarantee them a market for a period of time, or you might provide an umbrella in which it's easier for small firms to pursue their own path. So we know there are all sorts of models that we know about to enable this, but you've got to say to the advocates, no, this isn't a competition about putting the moonshot on your favorite roll of the dice, because that's what it is. Even if it's, even if it's well informed, there is uncertainty. And that's what your big question was, can we actually make policy to enable innovation? Yes, but we need some humility in the process. And without the humility, we just risk hubris and repetition of big mistakes, which will then cause a pendulum swing again between the state's the solution or the market's the solution. We all know it's going to be some mixture and hybrid of what's going on in the private sector, what's going on in the knowledge sector, what's going on in the public sector. I mean, that is what we know eventually will work, and that's what we need to encourage. And it's become a bit unfashionable for some reason. I don't know why. I mean, in my youth, we were always bored by the mixed economy, whereas now it seems to be a revolutionary statement to suggest that there might be a role for something outside of the business sector. But certainly, I think climate change has definitely changed our perception on this. And I think health is going to be going along the same route as well.
Thank you, Fred.